and welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Melissa Clark. The Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, has returned to Australia after a dash north to Papua New Guinea. For PNG, the visit was important to talk about trade, aid spending and police collaboration on law and order. For Australia, the critical issue was the progress of a new permanent processing centre for asylum seekers. But back home, the government's been under pressure to give more details about the proposed changes to carbon pricing. Joining me this evening to have a look at some of these issues is Labor MP Nick Champion, who's in Adelaide, and in Melbourne, Liberal Senator Scott Ryan. Thanks for joining me both this evening.
Thanks, Melissa.
To get started, let's hear from Kevin Rudd himself in Port Moresby this afternoon, talking about strengthening regional cooperation on people smuggling.
As Prime Minister of Australia, I will not shirk my responsibilities to deal with the ongoing challenge of people smuggling as it affects Australia, as it affects the wider region. And that's why I've been very frank about the fact that we'll continue our discussions with regional governments in Indonesia, here in Papua New Guinea and elsewhere across the region on a common regional response. A common regional response which seeks to reduce the scourge of people smuggling and those who depend on people smugglers to come to this part of the world. And in the case of PNG, we will work in dialogue with our friends in PNG to continue to strengthen and to further our practical cooperation against our common enemy, people smugglers.
That was Kevin Rudd speaking a few hours ago in Port Moresby. Nick Champion, the government seems to have all its eggs in one basket on this issue. It's relying on this regional summit to come up with something to help with the asylum seeker issue. Doesn't the government need to be doing more in the interim?
Well, look, I think Australia has all its eggs in one basket in relation to the fact that the country needs a regional solution. Labor's been pretty consistent on this matter. We obviously introduced a Malaysian transfer agreement into Parliament. We asked the opposition and the Greens to give us the power to implement a regional solution to this issue, the beginnings of a regional solution. And of course they rejected those proposals. So we've always believed that this is the way forward. We believe it's the only real way of preventing people being, people smugglers and the movement of people around the world is to have regional solutions. That's the way it was resolved in the 70s. It's the way it was resolved in the late 80s. And even under John Howard, that was the way it was ultimately resolved. So we believe this is the way forward, and humbly we'd ask the Liberal Party and the Greens to give us the power to implement it.
Scott Ryan, obviously the coalition doesn't support the process that the federal government is undertaking and trying to undertake, but surely you have to concede there's not much more Kevin Rudd could have done at that meeting with Papua New Guinea, given that Australia and Papua New Guinea are on the same page at the moment when it comes to asylum seekers.
Well, Melissa, that's the problem. We don't need more meetings. We don't need more photo opportunities for Kevin Rudd to fly around the world. Kevin Rudd said he wanted to take responsibility. Well, he can take responsibility. There are things Australia can do right now. Australia can reintroduce temporary protection visas. Kevin Rudd can take responsibility for changing the laws that worked. People smuggling only happens because there's a product for the people smugglers to sell, that they are selling passage to Australia. They are selling an immigration outcome to Australia. So the regional solution is not what is in Australia's power. What is in Australia's power is putting in place the laws that don't just work in theory, we know they worked in practice. And despite Kevin Rudd's photo opportunities and press conferences, the one thing he's not doing is taking responsibility.
But Scott Ryan, don't you face the same problem that Labor does now if the coalition is to win the election, and that is you could well be in government with these proposals to change the way we deal with asylum seekers, but yet not have cooperation from either the opposing party or the Greens and not be able to implement them? Don't you then have a little more sympathy for the Labor Party in that sense, that you could be in the same boat in just a short period of time?
Well, yeah, if we're entrusted with government by the people, we think we'll have a mandate for our policies. In fact, this is a policy upon which the coalition's been clear in opposition and was clear in government, that we believe in temporary protection visas and turning back the boats where it's safe to do so. And I note just, within the last couple of hours, the Indonesian Foreign Minister has conceded that is a matter that the Indonesian government is willing to discuss. We've done it before, we'll do it again, and if Labor are going to stand in the way of a solution to this problem, then they'll be judged for that.
Nick Champion, of course this has been a very difficult and even a tortured issue for the Labor Party, but given what's happened in the last couple of days, another life lost at sea, other people missing at sea, surely that creates some kind of impetus to do something other than merely wait for a meeting of regional leaders sometime in the unspecified future.
Well, look, Melissa, Scott talks about being judged. I mean, I think his party and the Greens party should be judged for their rejection in the Parliament, in the Senate and in the House of Representatives of the Malaysian Transfer Agreement. I mean, that was a real thing that we could have done to prevent these boats from coming, and it would have acted as a very big deterrent for people to transit through Malaysia on their way to Indonesia and other countries. If they were going to bounce back to Malaysia, that would have been a very big deterrent indeed to stop, to remain in UNHCR camps, to be processed appropriately and to avoid a dangerous boat journey. So, you know, the opposition can talk about John Howard. John Howard resolved a problem that had been created on his watch. 9,000 people came here under John Howard before the Parliament gave him the powers to act, and the Labor Party in opposition backed John Howard in. This opposition has been disloyal to Australia, sided with the Greens, and knocked over the Malaysian Transfer Agreement, and then they had the temerity to demand action in the very next breath. I mean, it's actually breathtaking that they can adopt these lines.
Just briefly before we move on, I want to ask both of you. It's possible Marty Natalegawa, the Indonesian Foreign Minister, has said that he thinks the regional summit might be sometime around August, maybe late August. That could well put it smack bang in the middle of an Australian election campaign. Does that change the way the Prime Minister should approach that meeting, or the way the Australian, as a Parliament, should approach that meeting? Nick, if I can ask you first, and then I'll get Scott to respond as well.
Well, obviously it will change things, because if we were in an election, we'd be in caretaker mode, and obviously conventions have to be observed. But look, I'd say generally we should be seeking a domestic consensus around this issue. We should be seeking an Australian approach when we approach our neighbours, and that means that the Liberal and the Labor Party should have a grand bargain. We should come together and try and have some domestic action on this matter.
Scott,
but what we've been hamstrung with is a disloyal opposition.
Scott Ryan, can I get your views briefly on what it might mean if we have a caretaker government election campaign when this regional summit comes up?
Well, obviously a caretaker government can't make commitments, but I'm not going to sit here and be accused of being disloyal by Nick Champion. Nick, if you want to talk about the grand bargain, you yourself said that Labor supported John Howard's laws. It was Labor that repealed them. That was the grand bargain. They were the policies that worked. You moved away from that.
Nick?
Well, you backed those changes through the Senate. The first time in 2008.
The Labor Party
you didn't oppose them in the Senate?
The Labor Party changed the laws that worked. I mean, take
Yes,
responsibility.
yes,
Nick, you're in government.
I think we're covering well-trodden ground here, and I'm not sure that we're going to cover that intractable disagreement on this program, so I might move on to another troublesome issue, certainly for both sides. And Kevin Rudd's seeking to address this one as well, in terms of carbon pricing. Now, the government has announced that it will be bringing forward the switch from a fixed price to a floating price for its emissions trading scheme by 12 months, but we're still waiting to hear the details. The opposition has said it's an admission that the carbon price hurts families and the economy. The Greens say it's a sneaky way to lock in an unacceptably low target for emissions reduction, and the government is on defensive. Let's hear from some of the players.
Going out now and making a big effort to say, look at me, I got rid of the tax and I'm going to flexible pricing, what he's going to do is undo a huge amount of good work and planning that has gone into the linkage with the European Union, that's gone into a whole lot of programs to help the economy transition and to make communities and the environment better off. We don't want to see those programs lost in this headlong rush just so he can say he did something different from the former Prime Minister.
It's the best way, the most efficient way and the cheapest way to reduce pollution. So if you can get the same environmental outcome for lower cost of living impact on Australian households, let's do it.
Nick Champion, we just heard Penny Wong there say that it's going to be a lower cost to Australian households, but we've been told repeatedly that households are not only being compensated but overcompensated. So why do you need to take this action at all?
Well, look, Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister always favoured a market mechanism for dealing with this, and always backed in a floating price. His preference for a market mechanism was well known, and I think we're just moving to that 1 year early. Obviously that will be welcomed by the Australian people, and it will allow, I think, Australians to transfer out of a pretty toxic debate that has been occurring over the last few years. Look, you know, the Greens and the Liberal Party will play politics on this matter. What Labor is about is defending working families, making sure they have good incomes, good jobs, and making sure that our economy transfers to a low-carbon future, but as effectively as possible, and a market mechanism does that.
Scott Ryan, the opposition has been very good at keeping the government on the hop on this issue, in keeping scrutiny on it, but Tony Abbott today seems to have managed to turn the spotlight of scrutiny on himself with a comment he made. Let's briefly hear that comment from Tony Abbott today.
Just ask yourself what an emissions trading scheme is all about. It's a market, a so-called market, in the non-delivery of an invisible substance to no one. I mean, let's think about it. It is a market in the non-delivery of an invisible substance to no one.
Scott Ryan, that's a pretty silly statement, isn't it? You don't ignore things just because you can't see them.
No, the point Tony was making there, Melissa, was that this is a market defined by European politicians. When they had a vote on this back in April, the price changed by 10% because they didn't get a procedural motion up. This is a false market. Nick Champion talks about market signals, but it's not a real market. It's one created entirely by the whim of politicians. And in response to Labor's announcement today, there's a very simple response. If it's good to have a lower carbon tax, it's better to have no carbon tax. On top of that, Labor's got form promising one thing on the carbon tax before the election and then not delivering. And finally, the issue here is with a floating carbon tax, the price is still designed to go up. You only have a floating price in order to force it higher. So the mechanism by which it goes higher is different, but the carbon tax continues to increase.
Nick Champion, just briefly before we have to wrap up, I'll just ask what you make of Tony Abbott's comment.
Well, look, Abbott's an airhead. He's just been caught out by his own sloganeering, and it might sound good in a front bar on a Friday night, but it doesn't stand the test on a Monday morning at work.
All right, we'll have to leave it there for today, but thank you both for joining us this evening. Scott Ryan in Melbourne and Nick Champion in Adelaide. That's all for Capitol Hill for tonight, but we'll be back at the same time tomorrow for more and all we've got in federal politics. Good evening.